Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Locating Your Ancestors Using Clusters. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceedingly Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Howdy, it's James Tanner here. We're going to talk about a fairly complex type of research that's called cluster research. The idea here is to examine the surrounding either cultural, religious, or other type of environment that your ancestors found themselves in. It's usually helpful to ferret out people who have very similar names. For example, if you've got 15 William Williams in your background, you've got to determine which one is your William Williams of all the different ones living in that same area. Or if you have people who seem to appear out of nowhere and seem to have no ancestors. All of these kinds of circumstances, many of which are referred to by genealogists as brick walls, are solved by analyzing a larger group of people than just focusing in on individuals and individual families. Okay, so first of all, we need to answer the question of what's a cluster. A cluster can be is a group of people that have an affinity in a certain way, and that affinity can be holding them together. It can be familial relationships. They could be relatives. This is based on a wider concept than what we look at as blood relationships of people who consider themselves related. The term that we use, which is more expansive, more inclusive, I would be a better word, than simple relationships, are kinship systems. A kinship system is more complicated. One of the most common examples that I give is in Latin America and in Latin-speaking countries, Spanish, Italian, other countries like that, very commonly based on the Catholic Church, that people have what are called godparents, a godfather and a godmother. These people have a specific and very defined relationship with the child at the time of a child's baptism, and with a couple at the time that they're married. And generally speaking, this godparent relationship persists throughout a person's life. That type of relationship, which is not necessarily something that we would have in our North American culture, except in certain ethnic groups, is the type of thing that we would be able to analyze through cluster research. Another type of relationship is the religion. People gather together in religious groups, any kind of relationship, and they may have a relationship as through a church or through other type of religious organization when they don't have any blood relationship. The next type is an ethnic heritage. It is possible that people who share ethnic heritage and ethnic heritage stay together in groups. Um, we're going to call those groups clusters, and they can be differentiated by their membership in that particular ethnic group. Another way of determining a cluster is by the language that the people speak. It's very frequently that when an immigrant came to the United States, which is a predominantly English-speaking country, that they tried to maintain the language of their homeland, and by doing so, they formed communities where people speak a predominant language. You can see this happening all the way across the United States. We have the classic Chinatown in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and many of the larger cities in the United States have ethnic sections based on the language affinity. The word I'm using here is affinity, A-F-F-I-N-I-T-Y, which means that they have a special relationship or they share some characteristics. Let me give an example of a cluster. This is a population schedule from the United States Federal Census. And if we look closely at this population schedule, we see that there are a number of people. Here's a Martin Tanner, here's a Henry Martin Tanner, and here's an Emma Tanner. If we extrapolate this and take this very, very brief example of just 3 families, and we take that out in a larger population, we can begin to see patterns of the way that the people are living, that they have a tendency to live closer to each other, to those people that they're related. Of course, there are, of course, people who live further away from the people who they're related to, but we won't worry about those. That's the hardest one to crack, is when everybody hates everybody. But in the other standpoint, this doesn't really break down. You know, you would think that in a modern mobile society like the United States and in Western Europe and places like that, where we have vast transportation systems, that these types of relationships would break down, but the answer is that they actually don't. People still live together in clusters and groups, even though they may not be based on the same traditional types of relationships that we may have seen predominant in the 19th and 17th centuries. So we can still analyze people based on their clusters, regardless of the time period. This is a valid way of analyzing it. Now, as we go through this, the issue here is understanding the concept, but also understanding how the concept applies to genealogical research, and then how we can use applying those concepts of cluster research to solving a specific problem, a very, very specific problem. So we'll go through a couple of examples as I go a little further in this presentation. Now, here's an interesting example. I showed you that cluster that was in a small town in northern Arizona called Joseph City, Arizona. Previous to that, it was called St. Joseph, Arizona. Well, this is my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather lived in that very small town on the Colorado Plateau in northern Arizona from the time shortly after when he got married until he died. And during that time, Henry Martin Tanner, my great-grandfather, left this one-page biography. This is essentially what we have of what Henry left as a result of his life. However, one of the things that was important to understand was he lived next door, virtually next door, to his neighbor, John Bushman. And John Bushman left an extensive diary. And so in that diary, you see references to Henry did this, and Henry and I did this, and I heard from Henry yesterday, and there's numerous explanations. using the diary and the records of his of the neighbors and the in the whole community, you're have been we've been able. I didn't do it, but my great uncle George S. Tanner wrote a biography of his father and also wrote extensive uh, histories of the town. So the research methodology that's used by a historian who goes in and writes the history of a town or the history of a community or of a state or whatever, that same type of analysis of looking at the overall relationships of the people and the movements of the population are the kinds of things that you examine when we talk about using cluster uh, research um, to do genealogy, to establish genealogical relationships. Okay, so uh, how do we find this out? Well, John Bushman diary and the papers that were collected by um, my uncle George Tanner uh, were left to the University of Utah Special Collections, um, and they were then also left to other special collections libraries, such as the Klein Library at Northern Arizona University, and also here where we are today at Brigham Young University in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections downstairs from where we are in the library. So this information was preserved in a library in sort of as research papers. And in the collection, for example, at the University of Utah, consists of about 6 linear feet of documents that pertain to this one little town and probably dozens of people in the town. So as we expand our concept of what it is to do genealogical research to include an entire town and an entire town across uh, the history of that whole um, uh, community, then we begin to understand the relationships and find all of the people that may have been left out and lost. Um, this is kind of the antithesis of the type of genealogy that we call extraction. Extraction genealogy says that if I get back to a small town, what I'm going to do is, and I can't differentiate between a certain number of people with the same surname. For example, I get back to town in Virginia and I have 5 people named John Morgan in that town. Well, the extraction method of approaching that would be to sit down and write and pull out everybody at the same surname and assume all those people were related. That doesn't work, just flat out. First of all, the example I used was John Morgan. Well, maybe I add one more fact that Morgan is one of the most common Welsh names that exist, and there is nothing that you would indicate that those people were related. It's like if someone walked up to you in the United States and you said, "Well, I'm from Phoenix, like I am, spent most of my life in Phoenix," and they say, "Oh, do you know John Smith?" You go, "Well, yeah, I know 5 guys named John Smith. None of them. Oh, they must be your relatives." No, that's not a valid assumption. We don't assume that people with the same surname are related simply by surname. This is particularly true in areas where the surname is has different origins. For example, they can come from patronymics where they're handed down from the father to son, father to daughter. They could be based on a occupation. It could be based on any number of other factors. That does not mean those people are related. Um, my name is Tanner, and Tanner is a very common name in England. And no, all the Tanners in the United States are not related, and we do not have a common origin. In fact, We find, if I go back to the 1600s when the tanners began arriving in America, there are at least half a dozen different tanners who arrived in America who were apparently unrelated. And so there's a lot of families here who can trace their ancestry back to a tanner and not at all be related. So this is not when we talk about doing cluster research, we're not talking about simply going into a town and copying down all the people who seem to have the same last name. That is not a cluster research. That is simply a matter of doing it a mechanical way of approaching a subject that doesn't really resolve the issues. So let's go on to a very important point. Um, this diary that exists of John Bushman that talks a lot about my great grandfather would never have been found had I not been doing what I call cluster research. I began investigating the neighbors and everyone else that had anything to do with my great grandfather. And as a matter of fact, one of the very first exercises I went through was to read through, if you call it that, examine every name in every census record that applied to this small town. They arrived in that area. The town at the time was called Allen's Camp, and they arrived in 1876 and 1877. And so the 1880 and the 1890 census, which no longer exists, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930 censuses. This was back before the 1940 census came out. But I examined each one of those censuses all the way through every line of every part of the census. Now that really sounds impressive until you realize there are only 16 pages on the census record for Joseph City. So it wasn't an overwhelming job. But that's the concept of doing cluster research, is beginning to examine the community as a community or as a group of people rather than focusing in on the individuals and the families. So let's kind of focus on one approach, and that is what's called a geographic cluster. A geographic cluster could be grave sites, and I'm going to use, for an example here, a program called Billion Graves. That would be, because one of the things that's interesting about the Billion Graves program, and let me explain that program. BillionGraves.com is a program that's similar to, in some ways, a very large and very popular genealogical program called findagrave.com, which is now owned by ancestry.com. Billion Graves differentiates their program from Find a Grave because they use smartphones, iPads, iPhones, Android phones with GPS capability to take photos of the graves, and then that records the GPS location, the geographic positioning system location of the grave exactly. And then that is uploaded to the Billion Graves website. So if you have a survey of a cemetery with Billion Graves, the program itself will show you with markers exactly where those graves are located. Now, if I were, for example, last Memorial Day, we were up in the Salt Lake City Cemetery, up above Salt Lake on the bench above Salt Lake, and that big cemetery, thousands and thousands of graves. After we had found the graves that we were interested in, we began to think of other graves that we would like to find. Well, by using Billion Graves and pulling up the map of the cemetery on that program, you could literally follow your little blue dot on an iPhone or Android and walk right over to the grave, and you'd be standing on top of it. So very, very effective way. But the program, because it keeps track of the physical location of the graves, it can be used to show geographic clusters. So This is the Billion Graves program. It's been recently redesigned, the website has, so it may not appear familiar to some people who've been working on the program previously. Um, so Billion Graves, we're going to use a program called Billion Graves Plus. Um, a lot of these programs have a free component, and then they have an enhanced or paid component, and Billion Graves is no exception. There is a free version of the program, but there is a valuable tool that's been developed that's called Billion Graves Plus. So we're going to look at that and see how that enables this idea of creating a cluster and analyzing that cluster uh, to occur. Okay, so for example, I'm going to use Henry Tanner again, and the grave site in Joseph City Cemetery in Joseph City, Arizona. And I do a search for Henry Tanner. I can search by grave, by cemetery, or I can search by the name of the people. There are various filters. I can filter it out to and refine my search to a date or a time or place, and that helps us to differentiate and find the people who are in the program. Um, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of graves already in Billion Graves. Uh, by the way, Billion Graves receives a substantial amount of interest and support uh, from myheritage.com. Um, kind of to explain that situation, um, Find a Grave and Billion Graves were, in a sense, competitors. They're both uh, indexing or trying to catalog the same cemeteries. Even though there are a lot of cemeteries in the world, there's still a finite number, and so eventually we'll have the number of people graves will slow down that are identified. But uh, they had those two programs, and they were both indexed and supported on the major websites on Family Search, on Ancestry, and on MyHeritage. Um, so you could search on any one of those three programs and search both programs. Um, what happened then was that Ancestry bought Find a Grave. After Ancestry bought Find a Grave, they decided that they did not want to have Billion Graves on their website, so they kicked Billion Graves off of the Ancestry website. Well, on the same time, MyHeritage was not sponsoring, but at least friendly with Billion Graves. And in order to differentiate the products, they kicked Find a Grave off of MyHeritage. So the only place you'll find them both today is on Family Search, who hasn't got any kind of a problem with either one, and so they have both Billion Graves and Find a Grave indexes. So if you want to search both at the same time, you can always go to Family Search. But it's kind of an interesting sidelight, but it's not. It is actually pertinent to what we talk about here, because a lot of people don't. When you say, well, uh, there's another program to look for graves on, and it's called Billion Graves, and not just Find a Grave. They say, well, yeah, I've already looked it up and Find a Grave, and the problem is that having multiple programs like this is a real advantage to the genealogists, because we get different inputs of the information, and that sometimes we can see where there have been problems and things have been missed by one or the other of the two companies. There are, by the way, lots of other indexes out there to to cemeteries. Okay, so now what are we going to do with this name that we found here? We can look at a picture of the cemetery, um, and that gives us an idea of what we're dealing with here. This is lovely out on the Colorado Plateau, flat ground, no trees, um, and just an interesting place. So the first thing I can do here is I can go look at the Joseph City Cemetery. So then I have 500 and plus 68 uh, graves that have been indexed or photographed or whatever, uh, and uploaded to a billion graves in that particular cemetery. And that gives me a list, an alphabetical list, if you will, of all of the people who are buried in that particular cemetery. That gives me a certain amount of information. One thing that it gives me is a sort of general survey of the surnames of the people who lived in that community. Secondly, it may give me sort of a rough estimate of how many relatives I have in the community, assuming that I know some of the other surnames of the relatives, Tanners plus others who lived in that area. I can see from a burial record like this how many people of my particular, with my particular surname lived in that area. Okay, now why is that important? Well, let's think of it this way, and I'll kind of go back through this when we talk about English counties. But if I'm looking for a particular surname, and someone has reported that that family lived in Joseph City, Arizona, or some other town, similar town across the world, then one of the first levels of doing a cluster research is to consider whether or not that is even a possibility. In other words, did people with that surname live in that community? If they didn't, why are you researching that? If they did, why aren't you researching that? In other words, there's kind of a threshold point here where you have to consider whether or not a particular family group was even in existence at that particular time and place where you're doing research. So with a list of all the burials, you're able to begin to look at, on billion graves, you can look at where all those people are buried. Now this is a satellite view of the cemetery, and those little, looks like a little yellow carpet there, are each individual markers for each of the graves in that entire cemetery. So what we can do now is to zoom in on the cemetery, and the yellow marker, which is not really awfully visible, it's much more visible on your own screen because you can keep zooming in or whatever, is Henry Martin Tanner's grave. So one of the things that we start making assumptions of is we assume that people who purchase or have people buried in a cemetery bury people near their relatives. So if a husband is buried in the cemetery, we can almost assume that his wife or his latest wife or whatever it is, whatever the relationship is, are going to be buried somewhere nearby. And in many cases, if there were children, particularly children who died in infancy, they would be buried nearby. So if we want to know uh, who might be in this family, who are the potential relatives of Henry Martin Tanner, one way to analyze that would be to think of it in terms of a cluster of people buried within a certain distance of Henry Martin Tanner's grave. If they didn't like somebody, they might be up there in that corner. If if they didn't like them at all, they might be in a different cemetery. There's all sorts of course, things that may not be consistent with the cluster research. But what we're finding with this is not specific exceptions to the general rule. What we're picking up here is trying to um, uh, work out an individual family out of a background of families that we may or may not be related to. So um, the classic example that I gave just a moment ago is where you have people with the same surname in the town and you're not sure which of the people in the town are your actual relatives. So your starting place here from this type of example is you begin to look at who's buried next to who in that town cemetery. So you have 5 people with the same name. Now you have 5 different clusters. You have 5 different sets of relatives in that town. And by looking at those sets of relatives, as opposed to looking simply at the individuals over and over again, you begin to see that there's a difference between these people. And it may very well be possible that you can find a connection to one of those people as opposed to the others by ruling out details in their lives and their pattern of their relatives. So this is, it's a way of looking at this. And it's hard to give generalities because this works only in very specific instances. In other words, I'm not going to generally find which of the 5 are the relative. I'm going to very specifically identify some factors that would either include or not include that person in your analysis of who you're related to. Okay, so now what we're doing is we can draw, there's Henry's grave, but using the Billion Graves program, we can draw a virtual circle around his grave and show in a list everybody that has a nearby grave. So I can look at the list of all the people who have graves that are nearby to Henry Tanner. The program allows me to drag with the mouse, drag that circle smaller or larger, so I can change the size of the circle that analyzes how many graves are inside that circle. I go down to a single grave, or I can move it out and start seeing who's buried next to that. Now here's the point. The point is, yes, you could go to Joseph City. Yes, you could wander around you don't have to want to wander very far, believe me, but you could wander around in the cemetery and find Henry's grave, and then you could plot out on a piece of paper and list everybody who was around. Let me tell you, the weather's a lot nicer on your computer than it is in Joseph City. So if you don't want to sit out there in a 50-mile-an-hour wind and it's 110 degrees, then or 40 degrees below zero, which are the 2 alternatives in Joseph City, that you can basically that's the situation, is that you can do this from the comfort of your own computer in your own home. Now, so here's Henry Tanner, and then here are all the people who have graves. And as a matter of fact, it tells you right here in the program how many feet down to a decimal point they are away from Henry's grave. So if you look, you can't see it, but like Emma is 3.4 feet away, Eliza's 4.1 feet away, Francis Sidney Tanner 7.3 feet north, and so forth. So you have exactly the distance, how far away these people are. Now, you could imply that because one wife was more favored than the other wife, that she was closer to Henry's grave, that you could start analyzing to see who was in favor in the family by this. But you'd have to be British royalty to really do that. You couldn't do that in Joseph City because they probably didn't even think about it. But they did think about putting people in the same plot. Now, why? Now, why would that happen? Okay, there's a very simple answer. People buy cemetery plots. They have to pay for them. And when they do, they usually buy a number of grave sites. And so that's why the families all get buried together. So even if they're generations, they may all be in the same spot in a grave. Okay, so all I have to do here is look for all the Tanners. Now, what about if I find somebody in the middle of all this whose name is Joel Bushman? Well, that's going to start to give me, or Ann Miller. That's going to start to give me some ideas here, because now I'm going to start to say, well, maybe this is a Tanner who got married, or maybe this is a Bushman who married into the Tanner family. So they may be born next to or live or be near someone who is a member of this family. And that begins to give us a little bit more. If you want to know people's the wives' maiden names, if you want to know what were the names of the surnames of the husbands, things like that you may not know from your own personal history. These may become very obvious when you start to look at the cluster of people buried in a cemetery. Okay, so now you can adjust, as I mentioned, the size of that area, and or you can include the whole cemetery. In this case, Billion Graves has a function that says show the cemetery plots, show the plats, the plat with all the cemetery plots, meaning the the properties that have been purchased by one family or one group of people. And they actually show the clusters here. If you look at that kind of with squinty eyes, you can start seeing that there's a pattern there to that, and that the people are arranged in groups. And those are the various family groups of people in that cemetery. Okay, now we're going to switch cemeteries here. Oh, well, no, we're not. Actually, we're going to do it. I was thinking I switched cemeteries when I did this, but I didn't. We're going to look in this as Joseph City Cemetery, and we're going to find a grave of a person named Baby Matlock. And the question is, who is that person? Who is she? He, what is it? A boy, a girl? We don't know. Is it a who was the Matlocks that it was belonged to? Who were the parents of this child? First of all, this child may not be identified in family records, may not have shown up in a census record, may not have shown up anyplace, other than the fact that there's a headstone here in the cemetery for a baby, and it apparently didn't even have a name. Okay, so we're going to actually move to a different cemetery. I guess I did move to a different cemetery, and this is this is the Mesa City Cemetery, and this baby was born in and this baby doesn't even have a surname. So we have baby 1899 to 1900, and the question is, who is this baby? Now, it would be nice if we had cemetery records, sexton records, and records from the cemetery that showed us who purchased the plot, or who was it that was buried here, uh, from whose family or whatever it was. Now, let's assume for the purposes of this example that we don't have any of that other information. All we have is a grave marker that says baby on it. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, the question is whose baby is this? And in Billion Graves, all I have to do is show the nearby graves, and I immediately come up with two candidates, Hannah and James Coffin, and they're 8 and 10 feet west of that baby. And as a matter of fact, they're the only couple that could be during that time period that would have been at that baby's parents. Okay, so now we're looking at family plots, and we're moving here from a search, uh, kind of a random search, or using the proximity, geographic proximity, to actually having the families plotted within the cemetery. And in this case, if we look at family plots on Billion Graves for that Coffin family, Hannah Coffin and James Coffin, we find that Hannah, James, and baby Coffin are all in the same family plot. So this has given us some two different ways, or two or three different ways of identifying an unmarked, an unidentified child's grave. So now we have an incentive to go out and do some additional research and see if we can come up with more information about the baby. As a matter of fact, just to add a little kind of information on it, that's exactly the kind of research I did in this cemetery, in the Mesa City Cemetery, and I found that they had what were called permits for burial, that were a form that was filled out from the state for a permit to bury a person. and that these babies were identified in those permits for burial, which were sitting in a file cabinet in the sexton's office at the on the cemetery site. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears here a little, and we're going to go to Find My Past. Now, Find My Past is a program centered in the United Kingdom. They have literally billions of records. Uh, the most concentrated and largest collection of records available for the United Kingdom, and they also have a lot of records from the United States, and they're acquiring other records. So this is a company that is rapidly advancing in their technology and in the size of their collections. Um, they are simply the largest company online database for England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Also, they are extremely into Canada, um, Australia, New Zealand. So very valuable records. Um, so we're going to use Find My Past here as to show clusters. And in one of the challenges of doing research in England is that very common surnames. So it seems like no matter which surname you have, uh, if you go to any particular county where those people were dominant, you have hundreds or thousands of people with that same surname. And it gets to be really interesting because you'll have 5,000 James Knights, for example, or whatever in the country. So it's very difficult, and it's very easy for people, and it's very common that I find that people confuse and choose a person with the wrong surname, with the same surname, same name, same everything, except they don't live in the same county and they're not the same family. So that's the situation here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look for one surname in an entire county. And this is a historical county in England, Huntingdonshire, which is now Cambridgeshire or Cambridge. And we're going to look for one of my surnames, Parkinson. And that's it. So we're just going to see, the question we're asking here is, how many Parkinsons were there in Huntingdonshire? In this case, there are 366. Now, assuming that I did this over and over again for different counties across England, I could form a pattern of where that surname was centered. As a matter of fact, Huntingdonshire is down in sort of south central England, sort of down towards London. Um, Lancashire, which is up in the northern part, close to the border with Scotland, has thousands of Parkinsons. And so what we probably end up thinking is, well, Parkinson's probably originated in the north, and then they've migrated into other parts. And actually, if you look at a map, there are programs out there uh, from the Guild for One Name Studies that will give you a list of the numbers, the statistics on all of the numbers of surnames in all of the counties in England during a specific time period. And so there are ways to find out this information, but using Find My Past is a pretty quick way of determining the frequency of a particular surname in the county. As a matter of fact, if you looked at the frequency of the plotted on a map of England, the frequency of the Parkinson surname, you can see the migration pattern. You can see how the numbers drop off as it goes off in certain directions, just as if they were migrating fewer and fewer people away from the core group of people in England with that surname. Okay, so we know that there's a relatively small number. We've searched every record on the United Kingdom on this huge website, billions of records over hundreds and hundreds of years of English history, and we've only come up with 366 people with the name Parkinson in that particular county. And if my people came from that county, it's going to be fairly doable to, let's say, separate them out from the background. And in fact, there may be an implication here because the number is so small that everyone with that surname is in that county is related in some way, because it's not, unless we had two separate infusions. So we might be able to get that. So we're going to look here, and then we're going to focus on a parish and a time. So my first search of all the records was directed at all the records for Huntingdonshire. And then I'm focusing on one parish, which is the Ramsey parish. And I have a year of birth. Now, Findmypast lets you do plus or minus 2, 5, 10, 20, 40 years. So that gives you a way of clustering. It gives you a way of increasing and decreasing the circle of interest around a particular search. So now I'm going to look for all of the people who lived plus or minus 20 years from 1800 in Ramsey, Huntingdonshire, and I have 14 people, and that's all. Now I begin to recognize some of my relatives. In fact, I have two Charles Parkinsons. I have a Newton Parkinson, Thomas Parkinson. I have Harry, Joseph, Hepzibah, John, William, Susan, etc. And then I can analyze these results to find family members. And in this case, there was a Charles Parkinson, and then who I knew, who was in my pedigree. There was a Charles Parkinson that was born years later, who was not in my pedigree, but in fact was born in a time period where there were missing children in the family of Charles Parkinson. So I was able to use this to find a family member who had not previously been identified. And the reason why it hadn't been picked up, there was a notation, and we found this is a burial record, and we found a notation on the burial record that he was not baptized, which meant that he was not in the parish registers. Okay, so when we're doing this analysis, what we need to do is be inventive. So let me give another example. Let's suppose that your ancestor comes from a non-English speaking country in Europe, and the classic thing is that that person comes over here and Americanizes his name or her name when she comes into the country, and the reference to where they come from is vague. For example, Germany. Germany, which in the 1800s is a very non-specific name, because there was really no, until really late in the 1800s, there was really no place that was identified specifically as Germany. That was all split up into various duchies and principalities and kingdoms that were all split into various fragmented area. So where do they really come from is the question. They come to the United States and they settle down in, and we're going to use a stereotype here, in Pennsylvania. So they came from Germany, they're coming over here, and they settled in Pennsylvania. And so you find their name, and their name is now completely different than the one they came across the ocean with. But you're able to find a passenger list, but that's as far as you go. You have no idea where these people came from. This is the ideal situation for beginning a cluster research. Rather than pounding away on researching that individual, you should immediately begin expanding your research to anyone who was related in this country to that individual, or anyone who spoke the same language or lived in the same neighborhood. And the answer is, if they lived in that same neighborhood and came to America, they probably came from the same place in Europe. And so you begin to, as you begin to look at a person living in those circumstances as a cluster, then what you're doing is you're expanding the base of people to look at, and the possibility that there are records that document where these people came from. So 2 doors down, you find somebody who didn't change their name when they came to America, and who identified specifically where they came from. You now have a more than a hint, you have a very strong possibility that your ancestor came from the same place that this other person came from. Um, and that becomes more and more of a certainty as you expand the number of people that you are focusing on and identify where they came from, because as you do that, you'll begin to see the cluster. You'll see that these people all came from this same little place in Europe, and they all settled in the same place in the United States. Now, does that get preserved, as the question, I guess, that would be asked immediately? Does that get preserved as we get closer and closer to the present? And the answer is yes. In a lot of cases, it does. In a lot of cases, even though people have traveled around the country, they still look at one part of the country as being their home, their place of origin, and that can be determined. Um, Sometimes the place that you consider home is not the place where you were born. Sometimes it's a place where you grew up, where you had friends, where you felt part of the community. And so uh, those are the kinds of things. Now, one other thing that we need to mention before we wrap this up is the whole concept of churches and congregations, people who have an affinity through a common religious belief. One of the most common ways of finding information of where the origin of an ancestor who crossed the ocean and came to America is to look at the church records of the place where they arrived. It is very, very, very frequent that the church has recorded the place of origin of the new member as they came into their congregation. This was done in many cases to verify membership in the group. And so this can be used for social organizations as well as religious organizations. Um, if a person, for example, was a Freemason in Europe and came to America and then joined a lodge, a Freemason lodge in Europe, in the United States, that that his or her, not her usually, but his relationship or membership with a lodge, a Freemason lodge in the United States, may enable you to track back to his Freemasonry lodge in Europe. There may be a record with the Freemasons as to where he came from. Um, this is all the case with all sorts of organizations, professional organizations, people who have a very specific and maybe identifiable trade, people who are very skilled in a particular area, artists, craftsmen, anyone who might have special skills. It may be using the relationships they have, the clusters of people that they associate with when they come to this country, that gives you a very strong clue as to their origin. Okay, so these are powerful tools um, that we call cluster research. Uh, they get more complicated in the sense that people use some additional electronic tools to do the analysis. Um, a lot of times they will take the information from a database, such as one of these online databases, and put specifically selected entries into a spreadsheet, and then use the spreadsheet to sort people by categories such as time periods and things like that, that will have a tendency to pull people together into family groups and more compact clusters where they can be able to have their relationship shown. Okay, do we have any questions out there? This, by the way, this last slide here is showing the different, is one slide of people who have some common thing and basis. So this is one way of showing, for example, where certain types of activities, types of people live. I think this one was a certain language. So it's like the German language speaking people or whatever in America. Okay, thank you very much for watching today. This is the Brigham Young University Family History Library. We would invite you to watch recordings of these webinars uh, that will be on our website, BYU Family History Library website, and also eventually uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube site.